The photograph was found in a trunk in the attic of a house in Mount Pleasant, Pennsylvania, in the spring of 1962. The house had belonged to the Kowalski family for 3 generations, but when the last of them died, the property passed to a distant cousin who had never seen it. He came from Chicago to sort through the belongings, expecting nothing more than a few weeks of tedious work. What he found instead was a leather-bound trunk, its brass fittings tarnished black, its lid held shut by a rusted lock. He broke the lock with a hammer and opened the lid to find the past staring back at him. The trunk contained a collection of photographs, letters, and documents, all dating from the 1860s. The photographs were tintypes, the kind that had been popular during the Civil War, their images captured on thin sheets of iron coated with dark enamel. Most of them were portraits, the stern faces of men and women who had lived and died long before the house had been built. But one photograph was different. It showed a group of men, perhaps a dozen of them, standing in front of a building that looked like a hotel. The building had a sign above the door, but the letters were too small to read. The men were dressed in a mixture of civilian clothes and military uniforms, and they were all looking at the camera with expressions that ranged from grim to defiant. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a date, October 8, 1862. And beneath the date, a single word, Centralia. The cousin had never heard of Centralia, Pennsylvania. He assumed it was a town somewhere in the state, perhaps a small village that had long since disappeared. He decided to do some research, to find out more about the photograph and the men in it. What he discovered would lead him down a path that no one had traveled in nearly a century, a path that would eventually uncover one of the darkest secrets of the Civil War, a secret that had been buried beneath the mountains of Pennsylvania for 100 years. Centralia, Pennsylvania, was once a thriving coal mining town, a place where men labored in the darkness beneath the earth to extract the fuel that was powering the Industrial Revolution. The town had been founded in the 1840s, when the discovery of anthracite coal in the region had attracted a wave of settlers and entrepreneurs. By 1862, Centralia was home to more than 2,000 people, a bustling community of miners, merchants, and their families. The town had 3 hotels, a bank, a newspaper, and a railroad station that connected it to the wider world. But Centralia was also a town with a dark side. The mines were dangerous, and the men who worked in them lived short, brutal lives. Accidents were common, and the death toll was high. The coal companies, which owned the mines and the land, treated the miners as expendable, a resource to be used and discarded. Wages were low, working conditions were appalling, and the miners had no legal protection against the abuses of their employers. The town was a powder keg, a place where the tensions between labor and capital were always simmering beneath the surface. In 1862, the Civil War had been raging for more than a year, and the town was deeply divided. Some of the residents supported the Union, while others sympathized with the Confederacy. The Irish immigrants who made up a large part of the mining workforce were fiercely anti-slavery and pro-Union, while the native-born Americans, many of whom had Southern roots, were more sympathetic to the Confederate cause. The divisions were bitter, and they often erupted into violence. The war had also brought a new element to Centralia, the draft. In the summer of 1862, President Lincoln had called for 300,000 new volunteers, and the states were scrambling to meet their quotas. When the volunteers failed to materialize, the government turned to conscription, and the draft became a source of intense anger and resentment. Men who had no desire to fight were being forced into the army, and they were looking for ways to escape. The coal mines of Pennsylvania, with their deep shafts and dark tunnels, became a refuge for deserters and draft dodgers. The photograph found in the trunk was a testament to this moment in history. The men in the photograph were not soldiers, at least not in the conventional sense. They were vigilantes, a group of men who had banded together to resist the draft and to protect their community from what they saw as the tyranny of the federal government. They called themselves the Centralia Rangers, and they were determined to stop the draft at any cost. The cousin who had found the photograph, a man named Walter Kowalski, was a retired schoolteacher with a passion for history. He had always been fascinated by the Civil War, and he had read dozens of books on the subject. But he had never heard of the Centralia Rangers, and he was determined to find out more. He began to research the town of Centralia, digging through old newspapers, census records, and county archives. What he found was a story of violence, betrayal, and cover-up that had been deliberately erased from the historical record. Walter Kowalski's investigation began with the town of Centralia itself. He discovered that the town had been a hotbed of draft resistance during the war, a place where the federal government had struggled to enforce its authority. In August 1862, a group of armed men, calling themselves the Centralia Rangers, had occupied the town, threatening to kill anyone who cooperated with the draft. They had taken control of the telegraph office and the railroad station, cutting off communication with the outside world. They had declared themselves the rightful rulers of the town and had vowed to resist the federal government at any cost. The response from Washington was swift and brutal. President Lincoln ordered federal troops to march on Centralia and restore order. A detachment of Union soldiers, commanded by Colonel James Clayton, arrived in the town on October 8, 1862, the date written on the back of the photograph. What happened next was the subject of intense controversy, a story that the government had tried to suppress for a century. According to the official report, the Rangers had surrendered peacefully when the troops arrived, and the town had been restored to federal control without bloodshed. But Walter Kowalski suspected that the official account was a lie. The photograph showed the Rangers standing in front of a building, but they were not surrendering. They were posed, confident, defiant, the kind of men who would not give up without a fight. The government's report, he realized, was a cover-up. Kowalski's search for the truth led him to the archives of the United States Department of War, which were stored in a vault in Washington, D.C. He spent months requesting documents, filling out forms, and waiting for responses. The bureaucrats at the War Department were not helpful. They told him that many of the records from the period had been lost or destroyed, and that he was unlikely to find anything of value. But Kowalski persisted, driven by a sense of mission, a conviction that the truth was out there and that he was the one who had to find it. His persistence paid off. In the summer of 1963, he received a package from the War Department containing a collection of documents that had been mislabeled and misfiled. The documents were letters, reports, and telegrams, all of them dating from October 1862. They told a story that was radically different from the official account. The letters revealed that the confrontation in Centralia had been a massacre. The federal troops, commanded by Colonel Clayton, had not come to negotiate. They had come to kill. When the Rangers had refused to surrender, the soldiers had opened fire, killing more than a dozen men. The survivors had been taken prisoner, their families and homes destroyed. The town had been burned to the ground, a punishment for its defiance. And then, the government had done something even more chilling: they had erased the massacre from the historical record. The documents also revealed that Colonel Clayton had been under orders from the highest levels of the government to make an example of Centralia. The draft resistance in Pennsylvania had become a serious problem, and the government was determined to crush it. Clayton's orders, which were signed by Secretary of War Edwin Stanton himself, instructed him to use any means necessary to suppress the rebellion. The order did not specify what means were to be used, but the implication was clear. The massacre had been a deliberate act of state terror, a warning to anyone who dared to resist the draft. Kowalski was shocked by what he had discovered. He had always believed that the Civil War was a noble struggle, a fight to preserve the Union and end slavery. But the massacre at Centralia was a stain on that struggle, a reminder that the war had been fought with cruelty and brutality on both sides. He decided to publish his findings, to bring the story of the Centralia Rangers to a wider audience. The publication of Kowalski's research in a historical journal in 1965 created a stir among historians. Some praised him for uncovering a long-suppressed truth, while others accused him of sensationalism and distortion. The controversy was bitter, and it continued for years. But Kowalski was not deterred. He knew that he had found something important, and he was determined to see it through. His investigation, however, was not yet complete. He had found evidence of the massacre, but he had not found the men who had carried it out. The names of the Rangers, the victims of the massacre, were missing from the historical record. Kowalski was determined to find them. He returned to Centralia, which by the 1960s was a ghost town. The mines had closed, and the population had dwindled to a few hundred people. The town was a shadow of its former self, a place where the past seemed to hang in the air like a fog. Kowalski spent weeks walking the streets, talking to the old-timers, searching for any trace of the men who had died in the massacre. He found nothing. But then, in the summer of 1967, he discovered something that changed everything. He was exploring the attic of a house that had once belonged to the town's mayor, a man named John Driscoll. The house had been abandoned for years, and the attic was filled with dust and debris. Kowalski spent hours sifting through old boxes and trunks, looking for anything that might be of value. At the bottom of a trunk, he found a stack of papers tied with a faded ribbon. They were the diaries of John Driscoll, a record of his life as a man caught between two worlds. The diaries were a revelation. Driscoll had been a Union sympathizer, a man who had supported the war and the draft. But he had also been a resident of Centralia, a man who had known the Rangers and who had tried to mediate between them and the federal government. His diaries, which covered the period from 1860 to 1865, were a detailed record of the events leading up to the massacre. Driscoll's account was remarkably detailed. He described the formation of the Rangers, their motives, and their fears. He also described the federal troops' arrival, their refusal to negotiate, and their brutal assault on the town. He wrote of the massacre with a mixture of horror and frustration, expressing his belief that the government had gone too far. But he also wrote of his own complicity, of the fact that he had been unable to stop the bloodshed. The diaries also contained a list of the Rangers, the names of the men who had died in the massacre. Kowalski transcribed the names carefully, cross-referencing them with the census records and other historical documents. He was able to identify most of the men, to trace their families, to learn their stories. They were not heroes, but they were not villains either. They were ordinary men, caught in an extraordinary moment, trying to protect their families and their community. The diaries of John Driscoll also revealed something else, something that Kowalski had not expected. The massacre at Centralia was not the only atrocity that had been committed in the town. There had been another event, one that had been even more carefully hidden. In the weeks before the massacre, the Rangers had killed two federal officials, men who had come to Centralia to enforce the draft. The killings had been brutal, the bodies mutilated and left in the street. The government's reprisal, the massacre, had been a response to those killings. The discovery was a turning point for Kowalski. He had initially seen the Rangers as victims, innocent men who had been brutally killed by an overzealous government. But now he understood that they were not innocent. They had committed crimes, and they had paid for them with their lives. The story was not a simple one, a tale of heroes and villains. It was a story of violence and revenge, a cycle of brutality that had consumed the town. Kowalski's research was a journey into the dark heart of the Civil War, a reminder of the cruelty and violence that had marked the conflict. He had started with a photograph, a simple image of men standing in front of a building. He had ended with a story of betrayal and massacre, a story that had been hidden for a century. The photograph, which had been preserved in the trunk in the attic, had been the key to unlocking the past. In 1970, Walter Kowalski published a book about his discoveries, titled The Ghosts of Centralia. The book was a critical success, praised for its meticulous research and its compelling narrative. Kowalski's work reshaped the understanding of the Civil War, revealing a side of the conflict that had been ignored by mainstream historians. The massacre at Centralia, he argued, was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of the violence and brutality that had marked the war. The book also sparked a renewed interest in Centralia itself. The town, which had been fading into obscurity, became a destination for historians and tourists alike. They came to see the site of the massacre, to walk the streets where the Rangers had stood, to search for any trace of the past. The town's residents, who had been reluctant to talk about the massacre for years, began to open up, sharing their stories and their memories. In the years that followed, other researchers followed in Kowalski's footsteps, uncovering additional evidence of the massacre. They found letters, diaries, and photographs that filled in the gaps in the story, revealing the full extent of the violence. The massacre had been more brutal than even Kowalski had imagined. The federal troops had not just killed the Rangers, they had tortured them, burning their homes and families, leaving nothing but ashes and bones. But the investigation also revealed that the massacre was not the end of the story. In the years after the war, the government had continued to suppress the truth, burning documents and threatening anyone who spoke out. The massacre had been erased from the official record, a deliberate act of historical amnesia. The story of Centralia was a warning, a reminder of the dangers of state violence and the importance of remembering the past. The story of the Centralia Rangers is also a story of the Irish in America, of the immigrants who had come to this country in search of a better life and had found only hardship and oppression. The Rangers were mostly Irish immigrants, men who had fled the potato famine and the tyranny of the British Empire. They had come to America with dreams of freedom and opportunity, but they had found only the exploitation of the coal mines. Their resistance to the draft was a rebellion against the system that had failed them. The Irish, who had been despised and marginalized by the Protestant establishment, had seen the Civil War as an opportunity to prove their loyalty to their new country. They had volunteered in large numbers, their courage and sacrifice earning them the respect of their fellow Americans. But the draft had changed everything. The Irish had been asked to fight for a cause that was not their own, a cause that offered them no benefit. The draft had been a violation of their rights, a reminder of the oppression they had fled. Their resistance, while violent and misguided, was a cry for justice. The massacre at Centralia was a turning point for the Irish community in America. The violence of the government's response, the brutality of the killing, had shocked the Irish and galvanized their political activism. They had realized that they could not rely on the government to protect them, that they had to fight for their rights themselves. The massacre was a precursor to the labor struggles of the late 19th century, a reminder that the fight for justice was a long and bloody one. In the end, the story of the Centralia Rangers is a story about memory and forgetting, about the power of history to shape the present. The massacre had been deliberately erased from the historical record, a crime against the memory of the dead. But the truth had survived, hidden in a trunk in an attic, waiting for someone to find it. Walter Kowalski's discovery of the photograph was the beginning of a long journey, a journey that led him into the heart of the Civil War. He had started with a simple image and had ended with a story of violence and betrayal, a story that had been hidden for a century. His work had uncovered a truth that the government had tried to suppress, a reminder of the brutality of the war and the price of resistance. But Kowalski's work was also a testament to the power of the individual, to the ability of one person to make a difference. He had not been a historian, not a professional researcher. He had been a retired schoolteacher, a man with a passion for the past. His determination and his persistence had uncovered a truth that had been hidden for 100 years. He had given the dead a voice, a reminder that the past is never truly gone, that it lingers in the shadows, waiting for someone to bring it to light. And yet, even after all of his research, after all of his discoveries, one question still nagged at Kowalski. The photograph that had started it all, the image of the Rangers standing in front of the hotel, had been taken on the day of the massacre. Who had taken it? And why? The photographers of the time were professionals, men who charged for their services and who were careful about the images they captured. Why would someone have taken a photograph of a group of men who were about to be slaughtered? The question haunted Kowalski for years. He searched for the identity of the photographer, but he found no trace of him. He searched for the hotel in the photograph, but the building had long since been destroyed. The photograph was the only evidence that the massacre had happened, the only visual record of the men who had died. It was a haunting image, a reminder of the fragility of life, the fleeting nature of existence. Kowalski died in 1982, his question unanswered. But his work continued, carried on by a new generation of historians and researchers. They searched for the photographer, for the hotel, for any clue that might explain the mystery. And in 1995, they finally found it. The photographer was a man named Samuel Prescott, a Quaker from Philadelphia who had come to Centralia to document the draft resistance. He had been sympathetic to the Rangers, and he had wanted to capture their image before they were destroyed. He had taken the photograph on the morning of the massacre, and he had hidden the negative, knowing that it would be dangerous to keep it. The negative had survived, preserved in a tin box in a drawer for more than a century. And when it was found, it revealed something that no one had expected. The photograph was not just a record of the massacre. It was a message, a warning to future generations. Prescott had carefully composed the image, arranging the men in a specific order, their expressions intentional. The photograph was a testimony, a statement that the men had existed, that they had fought, that they had died. It was a cry against the erasure of memory. The discovery of the negative was a revelation, a final piece of the puzzle. The photograph that had started it all, the simple image in the trunk, had been a deliberate act of defiance, a refusal to let the dead be forgotten. Prescott had risked his life to take it, and his courage had preserved the memory of the massacre for more than a century. The story of the Centralia Rangers is a story of ghosts, of the dead who refuse to be forgotten. It is a story of a photograph and a trunk, of a retired schoolteacher and a hidden massacre. It is a story of the Civil War, of the violence and brutality that marked the conflict, of the forgotten dead who lie beneath the mountains of Pennsylvania. The ghosts of Centralia still linger, their voices echoing through the empty streets and abandoned mines. They are a reminder of the price of resistance, of the cost of freedom. They are a warning to us all, a cautionary tale about the power of the state and the fragility of justice. And they are a testament to the power of history, of the ability of the past to shape the present and to haunt the future. The photograph, the one that started it all, is now housed in the archives of the Pennsylvania Historical Society, a testament to the life and work of Samuel Prescott. It is a reminder of the men who died in Centralia, of the massacre that was hidden, of the truth that was finally uncovered. And it is a question that lingers, unanswered, a question that will always haunt the ghosts of Centralia. Who were the men in the photograph? And why did they have to die? The answer, if it exists, lies in the darkness beneath the mountains, in the coal dust and the shadow, waiting for someone to find it.